here today, and Memorial Day weekend. It's a day that we don't quite know what to do with entirely. Remembrance, decorating graves, remembering those who have given their lives. We're grateful for them and those we miss. Oh, it means so much to us. Kind of like Thanksgiving. So many emotions feed into this one day. As we remember this man, we remember how many times that he'd taken this trip from the Upper Nile, and though it said he was from Ethiopia, that was a term that was used of the whole area of the Upper Nile, Ethiopia, Abyssinia. I remember the first time I heard the word Ethiopia, the nation Ethiopia, was in 1935 or 36, before most of you were born, when a rising young dictator from Italy, Benito Mussolini, invaded Ethiopia. Haile Selassie, the Lion of Judah. That's when we first heard of Ethiopia. It was once a very prominent place. Must have been this particular man, it must have been a man of some means, because it was an expensive trip to go from the Upper Nile in North Africa to Jerusalem, and he probably did this, if not every year, most every year, and going in the significant times of festival of the Jews, and sitting and reading. That meant he had a driver, and probably an accompanying guard or a contingent from the temple police sent by the queen, because he was a man of some means. And he was treasurer in the court of the queen of the house of Candace. Now that's not a proper name, that's a line or a succession of royalty of the house of Candace. And as was the custom, as in many cultures, men who worked in a court in the almost constant presence of women, he was neutered, caponized, sexually modified. He was a eunuch. Some of the information, and some of which is based on pure gossip, portrays such people as being effeminate, simpering, fat, generally not very attractive, or in behavior or in appearance, for they've been sexually altered, and that changed everything about them. Mutilated, in fact, and regarded as a kind of freak, I think, even though many like him rose to the place of some prominence, as we said. Yet this was the big flaw that hung over everything. He was a eunuch. He was what Jews commonly referred to as a God-fearer, not a Jew, but an admirer of the religion of the Jews, because there were many all over the near Middle East that admired the religion of the Jews, for they were monotheists. They believed in one God, and where the cultures all around them had many gods, and they were structured. They had a law that was in place and you could count on, and they had a place of impressive worship. So many things about the Jews that attracted people of other races and other religions. So he went annually, we imagine, or at least regularly, to the Jewish special seasons to seek something, looking for something. But as attracted as he was to the religion of the Jews, he was still an outsider. Oh yes. For the law of these people in the book of Deuteronomy, the 20th chapter, plainly states anyone who has been emasculated, you know what that means, cannot go in and be a part of God's people. Pretty plain, pretty plain. Anybody like him had to stand on the outside. They could not draw near to God's people. For the law of these people said, no one who has been thus treated can be a part of the assembly of the Lord. You knew that was in the Bible, didn't you? And that meant that him and his kind were excluded. A high official, notwithstanding, made no difference. Riding along, he was reading from the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. And I could not help but remember as I read from that same one book, the same reading, the same text that this man read from in our Old Testament lesson this morning from Isaiah 53. And I'm sure not for the first time, nor telling how many times he'd read these words and he'd pondered them. A man who was despised and rejected of men. Man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. One of the suffering servant passages in Isaiah. He knew what that meant. He'd felt that. He had been a man of sorrows. He was acquainted with grief. He knew what it meant to be excluded. One like that wondered, one like this would know how I feel, he thought, surely. But exactly who was this that was speaking? Who had written these words? Who was this suffering servant? And enter Philip. Let me reintroduce you to Philip. He was one of the 7 that was elected by the church in Jerusalem when the Hellenistic Jews complained that their widows and their folks were passed over by the traditional old Jews who sort of looked down on the Hellenistic Jews as being second-class citizens. They passed over them in what? In the distribution of the food, in the distribution of the provisions. As you know, they had a common store, and they brought it to the church, and it was distributed. And some of the Hellenistic Jews said, our folks have been bypassed. And so the church did one of the healthiest things that you can ever think of a church doing. They appointed a committee. But it was a different kind of committee. It was a committee made up, so we can tell from the names, of Hellenistic Jews. Jews that were raised in a Greek culture. And Philip was one of those. So was Stephen. And Philip came along and walked up beside the man riding in a chariot. And I kind of wonder if he was jogging. You think Philip was jogging to keep up with it? I don't know how fast the chariot moved. Philip heard him because the man was reading aloud. And so he asked without any formal introduction, whatever, do you understand what you're reading? Pretty impertinent, you might think. Do you understand what you're reading? The eunuch answered, and, I wish I knew his name. We just identify him as a eunuch. He was a man, he had a name, he had parents, he had family. I wish I knew more about him. But he answered, do you understand what you're reading? He answered as if it was the most natural thing in the world for the stranger to ask this, do you understand what you're reading? And so the eunuch answered, well, how could I unless somebody explained this to me? And it's a normal practice, and we've pretty well gone with that. We don't always understand things on our own. We need some help sometimes. How can I understand this unless somebody guides me? And maybe that's why he asked, how can I ask, and someone makes it plain to me? I'd like to know what it means. And then he said, come up here and sit with me. An invitation. And this is what he was reading. He was led as a lamb before the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. He was despised and rejected of men. He had a question, and the question had occupied the eunuch for a long time. Who is the prophet talking about? Himself or someone else? It's a good question. And there had been, and there still are, several possibilities who the prophet was talking about. Unidentified, servant of the Lord. There's about 4 or 5 of these in the book of Isaiah. And some have thought, well, it was the prophet Isaiah himself. And the eunuch asked that as a possibility. Was he talking about himself? There are some who think that. And some say it was the nation Israel. And the nation as a whole. They would suffer. And they would be despised. And they did suffer, and they were despised. So who was he talking about? Well, we say Jesus fulfilled that. But let me make it very plain. Jesus didn't do this in order to fulfill what the prophet said. That's backwards. The prophet said it, and Jesus lived it, and that fulfilled what the prophet did. Jesus did not do what he did in order to fulfill what the prophets had said. But the New Testament church, the early believers, grew up on this passage and others like it. And they looked at the life of Jesus and what he did and what he said and how he died. And they said what he did fulfilled Isaiah's vision of the suffering servant. Whatever the prophet felt, whatever the prophet Isaiah meant, Jesus had fulfilled it. Whatever the prophet had in mind, Jesus was the suffering servant. He knew such a one. Isaiah did. He knew there would be such a one. This is what the prophets knew. They did not nail it down by year, by date, by name, but they knew there would be such a one, that God would provide. More than that, listen, God would make himself known in the suffering servant. And I must return to a theme that I've tried to devote some time to over and over again lately. God would make himself known in the suffering servant. God himself would experience what it meant to be despised and rejected. God himself. And beginning right there, Philip told him the good news of Jesus, which for him was this. What was the good news of Jesus? Come up here and tell me about it. And so Philip got up there and he told him about it, and this was the good news. You feel despised and rejected. You feel left out. Let me tell you of one who knows what that means, who experienced what that means in himself. And he is God with us, Emmanuel. He is God for us. He was bruised for our iniquities, and with his stripes we are healed. God was not just suffering. This suffering servant was not just God suffering. He was God suffering for us. That's different. Not just God suffering. That we may not be despised. That we may not be excluded. That we might draw near to him. Oh, I wonder if the eunuch had read on to in the scroll of the prophet Isaiah to Isaiah 56. If you haven't read that lately, you ought to read it. For Isaiah 56 says this: let not the eunuch think that he has been shut off or excluded. Let the eunuch draw near, for God has included him in the family. The prophet Isaiah had already claimed the fact that God had made room for the eunuch, for the stranger, for the foreigner. Let them not say that I am left out. Did this mean new rules? Did it mean God had changed the law? Had God changed? You tell me. No. They'd come to understand that this God that we have worshiped is a more accepting, bigger, more loving, greater grace-filled God than we had imagined. I remember reading J.B. Phillips' little masterpiece years ago, in which he said, your God is too small. The Jews' God was too small. They had a God that had left people out. And Isaiah said, this is who God is. He has made room for the stranger. He has made room for the foreigner. He has made room for the eunuch, for the one who is outcast. You may have thought earlier on that this is the God who leaves people out, but he is not such a God. And now you are to be witnesses of this. Jesus said to the disciples before he went away, you are to be my witnesses of these, that God is this kind of God, that God is the grace-filled God who opens his heart to everyone. Be my witnesses to the end of the earth. Jesus had told them that. I'm here. They had said, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? No, 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 no. This is not what it's about. You are to wait for the leading of the Spirit, and then you are to be my witnesses. And Philip, as one of the 7, went out and did that. You see, they had been called to distribute the food and to treat people fairly, but every one of the 7 took their job as being more than that. Philip became a preacher and a witness. The witness at its best. What is a witness? It is to tell the story, to be the good news wherever you are. The eunuch had invited Philip to come up there and sit with him. Don't miss the meaning of that. We do not kick the door down. Jesus said, as recorded in the book of Revelation, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone will hear my voice and open the door, then I will come in and sup with him and he with me. But he does not kick the door down, nor do we. When we're invited, we go in. My goodness, if we could learn that lesson. Philip, walking along by the side of the chariot, asked the man, do you understand what you're reading? How can I? And he invited him to come up and sit with him. And Philip told him the good news. Come up here and tell me what it means. Now, when you receive such an invitation, you answer that. But you probably need to wait for it. Well, and then they travel along. We're coming to the end of the story. They're traveling along. Maybe a long time. We don't know how long. Maybe it was a long trip. And they talked as they rode along. As is nearly always true with Scripture, the details were not told. The Scripture does not tell us how people feel. It tells us what they did. And this is always true, that nearly every time that we hear Jesus talking to people, we realize he talked to them much longer time than we're told. Nicodemus and he sat down and spent probably the evening talking together, not just in those few sentences. When Jesus stopped at the home of Zacchaeus and ate with him, he probably spent the day with him. And at the end of the day, Zacchaeus made the decision to give his life and all that he had to the Christ. And we know this about the Ethiopian eunuch. He had received the good news, because when they came to the oasis, and probably an oasis, there was a place where there was some water. He said, here's water. What is there to prevent me from being baptized? Is that all there is to it? Well, there are some people that think it has to be more than that, because in some of the translations, maybe in the translation you have, it says that the eunuch said, what is there to prevent me from being baptized? That Philip responded, if you believe with all your heart, you may be. And the eunuch said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. That's not in the older manuscripts. Why was it included? Because there are some legalistic scribes that say it just must be made a little more exact than that. We must know exactly what the man believed before he was baptized. I cannot enter into that. See, we cannot enter into that sacred territory where a seeking soul comes in contact with God. We've got to put down the rules, and we've got to write the creed. No, not so. It was left with the fact that Philip, accepted a man who believed in the Lord, not from all that he said, but from his request. I'm ready to be baptized. And Philip stopped the chariot and baptized him. I want to linger on that just a little longer. We're so concerned that people say it exactly right, that they use the exact words, that we're not willing to trust people in their quest for God, to say that I've come to know God as he is and I've given my life to him. I may not have used the correct words. I may not have used the words you think I should have, but I've given my life to him. I don't need the addition of some scribe, because there are many of us who are not willing to accept the reality, the real facts, that most of the time people respond to the gospel, respond and express their faith in many different ways. We don't all say it the same way. The scribes and the legalists insist, no, you've got to say it just right, or it doesn't count. No matter that in the gospel, in the New Testament encounters, these exact words are not always used. Not always said that you must say that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. It doesn't say that. It was enough to Philip that that man had heard the good news and he was ready to give his life and to be baptized. Exactly when did the Ethiopian eunuch make that decision? When? Can you name the minute? No, you can't. I'm reminded of C.S. Lewis, who was asked one time, Lewis, when did you give your life to Christ? When were you saved? And he said, I can't remember the exact moment, but I remember one time I took an excursion on an excursion bus. And when I got on the excursion bus, I was not a believer. And when I got off the excursion bus, I was. Do you understand what he meant? Somewhere in there, he had found that he had given his life to God. He had trusted him. But to try to put down a pen and say it was right there, you can't do that. And we don't need to do that. The eunuch came to a decision to give his life to this suffering servant that he'd heard from Philip. And Philip said, I believe you're ready. So he stopped and they went down into the, well, by the way, I don't go to seed on the matter of being immersed and all that, but it's obvious that they went down into the water and Philip put him under. And this is not necessary. I didn't mean to imply that. But they stopped at a place where they could be immersed, and he went on his way rejoicing. That's where the story ends. We don't know what happened after that. We do know that there was a church fellowship started in North Africa, the Coptic Christians. We've heard lately that they underwent some persecution. We know that there was a church fellowship that flourished for a while and then was wiped out. You know, we never know what's going to happen to the faith once we share it and once there are people who receive it. We don't know what's going to happen. All we know is we have done what we were called to do. And this person said, I have received that good news. Philip was a witness, and I just want to linger there a moment. He was one of the 7 called. He was called Philip the evangelist by the early church, because that's exactly what he was. Wherever he went, and he went to all kinds of places, hither and yon. He went to Samaria. Wherever he was an evangelist, which doesn't mean that he just preached and, no, he was a witness. He was an evangelist. When he met a man of some authority, some standing from the court of the Queen Candace, for all of his standing, there was one who was still rejected and excluded from the fellowship. Philip introduced him to one who was in fact the grace of God made flesh and blood. That's who the suffering servant was. The grace of God made flesh and blood to experience what we all experience, even our suffering and our rejection. And this man went on his way rejoicing, because he knew now that he had been received into the family of God. He was no longer on the outside looking in. He was no longer a freak. That's what the suffering servant does for us. Standing at a distance and just hearing about it. I hope it makes some difference in your life today. Let's pray.